seeing sort of some of the numbers stabilizing. I'm sure more will join soon, but so it's my pleasure again to host another webinar in the ISHR JMCC series, which has been going on for quite a while now. So it's nice. It's nice to see longevity of this webinar series. It's a really exciting webinar today. It's a JMCC paper of the month, so Editor's Choice paper of the month. And I'm pleased to say that we've got Walter Knight, Dr. Walter Knight from University of Colorado in Denver, as a host, as a chair, sorry. And Walter, I leave it to you now to introduce the speakers and obviously share the webinar.
Thank you very much, Davor. So yeah, it's my pleasure to share this today. So we've got two really great speakers today, both at the University Institute of Experimental Pharmacology and Toxicology at the University Medical Hamburg-Eppendorf. And that is Professor Dr. Lucie Carrier and Dr. Torsten Christ. So Dr. Carrier is a professor of functional genomics of cardiomyopathies and a team leader in the Department of Experimental Pharmacology and Toxicology. And she has published extensively, 161 publications to date with a H-index of 52, which is fantastic. I think we all know her very well for the fantastic work she's done on myosin binding protein C3 in terms of its stability and developing cell-based and animal-based models of cardiomyopathy. And Dr. Torsten Christ is also at the University Medical Center of Hamburg-Eppendorf, and he is an electrophysiologist. And he has also published extensively, nearly 80 peer-reviewed journal articles to date and an H-index of 29. So both very good speakers today with really fantastic publication records, and I think we're all very excited to hear from them. So before I leave things to Dr. Carrier and Dr. Christ, the only thing I'm going to ask is anyone who has questions, please try to submit those through the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And time permitting, we'll go through as many as possible after the seminar. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so I guess I need the, yeah, exactly. No problem. So let me share my screen. All right. So first of all, Walter, thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I'm very happy to present today. Torsten Christ is going to join me for the discussion, but we work together for this paper. We co-direct this paper. So I'm very happy to give this JMCC ISHR cardiovascular webinar on translational investigation of electrophysiology in hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Okay, so I will start with this slide because I like it a lot. I mean, actually, it's maybe there is one before. No, okay, it goes directly without animation, doesn't matter. In any case, I'm working, as you said, Walter, on hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is characterized by left ventricular hypertrophy, which is mainly asymmetric, involving the interventricular septum. It's mainly associated with diastolic dysfunction and energy depletion. And you can see below here, there is a massive myocardial disarray with an increased interstitial fibrosis. The estimated prevalence, which was based on hypertrophy, is about 1 in 500 individuals. And it's also important to know that HCM has been shown to be the leading cause of sudden cardiac death, particularly in young athletes. And there is an example of this Italian soccer who died playing soccer at the age of 25. And this has been found in several athletes. So hypertrophic cardiomyopathy is a disease of the sarcomere, which is represented here. It involves rare pathogenic variants, and which have been found in different components of the thin filament of the sarcomere, the thick filament, and also component of the Z-disc. The problem of HCM is that, first of all, the rare variants do not explain the large clinical heterogeneity, and second, there is a high percentage of HCM patients with no variants in sarcomeric protein, considered as sarcomere negative. HCM is also associated with arrhythmias, and it could explain the risk of sudden cardiac death. So this is the first study, which you see the date of these studies are quite early, which shows actually this first study, which was published by the group of McKenna, which showed the percentage of patients with non-sustained ventricular tachycardia, VTs, which is age-dependent to reach 20% of the individual with HCM. And you see that this is associated with a marked increase in sudden cardiac death in this cumulative survival. The second study, which has been published by the group of Maron, was performed in less individuals, 178 individuals, which received actually 24 hours Holter ECG. And you can see here the percentage of patients which present arrhythmia, most of them, more than 80%. And you see that with, more than 80% present at least one premature ventricular complex. And you see that if increase the number, even more than 20% presented with more than 200 premature ventricular complex. So what are the risk factors of sudden cardiac death? So I took this image from the review of Sabine Hoek, who actually left much too earlier, which shows the different impact for the sudden cardiac death in HCM. So first, the molecular cause, of course, the sarcomeric mutation, is the primary cause of potential sudden cardiac death, which is associated with non-structural changes like energy cost of contraction, which is increased, myofilament calcium sensitization, perturbed length-dependent activation, and then it could induce diastolic dysfunction, altered intracellular calcium homeostasis, altered cardiac energy metabolism. And then, of course, there's other factors like the lifestyle, the exercise, the stress, which also together with the different genes involved or modifier gene could increase the risk of sudden cardiac death. And we should not forget that there is also the family history, previous events in the patient of ventricular arrhythmias or unexpected syncope, which actually act as a secondary but are very important to increase the risk of sudden cardiac death. So today I will present this August GMCC Editor's Choice, which has been a collaboration between Hamburg, Lewiston, Tampere, Amsterdam. And actually Thorsten Christ and myself are here today, but the person behind it is Frederick Flener. So Frederick is not in a lab anymore, but he did his PhD thesis with me. And you can see him that he also likes playing guitar, but he's also attending different seminars and scientific meetings. And this one was the ISHR European section in Hamburg. But now he left academia because, as you know, everywhere in the world it's not so easy to develop a career. And in Germany, you need to get a professorship position if you want to continue in the university medical centers. So he left academia, but still he did a great job during all his time here. And he also liked to play soccer. You can see him here, together here with Thorsten Christ, with the second person behind this story. So the goal of this study was to evaluate if HCM causing myosin protein C mutations induce arrhythmias, and we use 3 different models. The first one is the heterozygous and homozygous knock-in mice targeted for myosin protein C. The second one was human iPSC-derived engineered heart tissues carrying a homozygous myosin protein C mutation. And finally, we used septal myectomies of HCM patients. So this slide shows you the structure of the sarcomere again, with the localization of myosin protein C in red. It's a staining here on adult mouse cardiac myocytes. you see these typical doublets of C protein, which is organized in the A band, in the C zone of the A band of the sarcomere, and it's surrounded by actinin staining in green. So myosin binding protein C in human has the following genomic structure, and you can see the localization and the number of the different mutations which have been found in human. And what is important to know is that most of the mutation, you see the total number is more than 360. Most of the mutation actually are truncating, leading to a truncated protein, which is normally not detected in the tissue sample of the patients. So the molecular mechanism, and we will focus on the left part of this slide, is the following. So the patients, they are heterozygous for the mutation, and they have a wild-type allele and a truncating allele. The wild-type allele produces a wild-type protein. The truncating allele, in contrast, is regulated by two systems, the nonsense mediated mRNA decay, or NMD, and the ubiquitin proteasome system, and this leads to a very low level, if any, mutant protein in the sarcomere. So together with the wild-type protein, it leads to myosin protein C3 haploinsufficiency, which leads to the typical feature of HCM, which are left ventricular hypertrophy, diastolic dysfunction, and energy depletion. This part concerns the severe form of cardiomyopathy, which are due to two BL-leak truncating mutation in myosin protein C. It's not the subject of today, actually. Okay, so we developed a mouse model already long time ago, and we did several things in this model. And just for you to know that we have the heterozygous and the homozygous mice. The heterozygous normally should mimic the situation in the patients. This one carries a G to A transition on the last nucleotide of exon 6. So you see that in the heterozygote there is 3 different mRNA, the wild type, of course, produced by the wild type allele, and there is 2 mutants, 2 and 3, which actually are due to the skipping of exon 6. And at the protein level, what we see mainly is the presence of the wild type protein for 80% of the control, and there is a low level of the truncated, the other mutant protein. The homozygous mice, in contrast, you see they have mutation on both alleles. They don't have wild type protein, they have a missense mRNA, and the 2 other mutant mRNA due to the skipping of exon 6. And at the protein level, what we see mainly is this mutant, the missense mutant, and also a little bit of the mutant 3. But mainly what we should remember is that the homozygous, they only have 10% of mutant myosin protein C protein. So in the past and several times we evaluated the cardiac phenotype of these mice, and you can see here the left ventricular mass to body weight ratio and the fractional area shortening determined by echocardiography, and you see clearly that only the knock-in mice, the homozygous, develop left ventricular hypertrophy and systolic dysfunction. The heterozygous, they do not have a specific phenotype. But then if we looked at the myofilament calcium sensitivity, which is expressed and evaluated in a skinned cardiomyocytes or skin muscle strips, you can see that the force calcium relationship, and normally if there is increase in the intracellular calcium, you have an increase in force, and you see that in the heterozygous and in the homozygous, there is a shift to the left, indicating higher calcium sensitivity, and which shows that to produce the same force, you need a lower concentration of calcium in both cases. And you see here the calcium sensitivity as expressed as a PCA 50, which is higher in both heterozygous and homozygous knock-in mice. The maximal force did not change really, and nor the N-yield coefficient. But then we evaluated the diastolic function in vivo, because increased calcium sensitivity could lead to diastolic dysfunction. So we measured the diastolic function by 2 approaches. the pulse wave Doppler analysis and the tissue Doppler imaging. So you see these typical waves, the E and A wave in the wild type, and the E prime and A prime wave by TDI in the wild type. And you see that the E wave is lower in the het and the homozygous knock-in, and similarly the E prime wave is reducing in the heterozygous and the knock-in mice. So this leads to the ratio of E to A, which was lower in both heterozygous and homozygous knock-in mice, and the same for the tissue Doppler imaging, E prime to A prime ratio, which were markedly lower in both these mice. So, in summary, the phenotype of these mice is an increased myofilament calcium sensitivity and diastolic dysfunction, and this is common in both homozygous and heterozygous knock-in mice. And therefore, this is independent of left ventricular hypertrophy. So we ask the question, are these phenotypes sufficient to induce arrhythmias? So we first evaluated the effect of the combination of 30 nanomolar isoprenaline with a pacing frequency of 5 Hz in mouse ventricular myocytes in the different groups of genotype. So you see that and then we evaluated the arrhythmic behavior, the percentage of arrhythmic cardiomyocytes, and you can see that when compared to the wild type, the percentage of arrhythmic cardiomyocyte was higher in both homozygous and heterozygous knock-in. And as a positive control, we used wild-type myocytes treated with 3 macromolar of the known calcium sensitizer EMD 57033, which indicates that these arrhythmic behavior are likely due to the previously shown increased calcium sensitivity. So we then measured the arrhythmic behavior of mouse left ventricular muscle strips, and in this case, we did, after the measurement in baseline, we did the concentration response curve to isoprenaline, and you can see that when you compare to the wild type in black, both the heterozygous in green and the homozygous in red develop a higher susceptibility, isoprenaline dependent, isoprenaline concentration dependent, to develop arrhythmias. And when we treated this when we treated the wild type muscle with 4-aminopyridine, which is a potassium voltage gated inhibitor, we found the same similar response with development of arrhythmic muscles. But you see that the EC50 for isoprenaline was much lower in the case of wild type treated with 4-aminopyridine than the homozygous knock-in. So this shows that there is, in cells and in muscle strip, there was increased number of arrhythmic cells or muscles. So to test whether this can be also occurring in the whole heart, we did use Langendorf perfused heart with a burst pacing protocol with decreasing burst pacing cycle length. So these are typical electromyogram obtained in a wild type and in a homozygous knock-in. So you see here the stimulation burst, and then you see that in the wild type hearts go back to the normal sinus rhythm. In contrast, the homozygous knock-in heart did go to ventricular tachycardia. So we measured this, and we found that in the homozygous knock-in, but not in the heterozygous knock-in, there was a markedly increased number of VT events during the burst protocol. And this was important as well, that we saw that it was associated with a prolonged ventricular refractory period. So, to understand whether this prolonged refractory period could be due to a difference in repolarization, we perform measurements of action potential with sharp microelectrode in this left ventricular muscle preparation. But first, I want to go back to this classical ventricular action potential, which is obtained in mouse, and I adapted this from this quite old work of Jeanne Nerborn. And so you see that in mouse, the action potential is very short, and this is different than in human. I will come back to this. And this is composed of mainly 4 different phases. The first one, which is the resting membrane potential, which is followed by the rapid depolarization and entry of sodium. And then there is a phase 1, which is the partial repolarization, which concerns ITO, fast and slow current, potassium current. And then there is a phase 2, which is mainly due to the entry of calcium, but also partial repolarization with IKS. And finally, the phase 3, which concerns actually the rapid repolarization, we don't see it here, of the IKR. You see that in mouse, actually, IKS and IKR are absent, and this is in contrast to human action potential, where the phase 2 is very long and phase 3 very rapid. Okay, so we measured action potential in these 3 different genotypes, and you see here the typical representation. You see that the wild type and the het knock-in, which is presented with this dot red line, are confounded. And in contrast, you see a prolongation of the action potential in the homozygous knock-in only. And this prolongation was seen at 20% of repolarization and 70% of repolarization. So then we ask the question whether this prolonged action potential in the knock-in is also found before the development of hypertrophy. And this was not easy to be done because the knock-in mice, they develop hypertrophy at the age of 7 days. So we did analyze the action potential at postnatal day 1, which is known not to be associated with hypertrophy. So these are the results. You see that at postnatal day 1, the homozygous knock-in also present a prolonged action potential. You see this at 20% of repolarization and 70% of repolarization. And this was also interesting to see that in both adults and neonates, the maximal upstroke velocity, which actually started with the same resting membrane potential, did not differ between the genotypes. So this suggests that the sodium currents did not differ between knock-in, homozygous knock-in and wild-type mice. So then we wanted to test if abnormalities of repolarization in the homozygous knock-in is due to altered gene expression of the potassium channels. And we developed specific nanostring and counter element panels to evaluate the ion channels in human or in mice. So these are the results obtained in adult mice, in the wild type and the homozygous knock-in. And here I wrote that there was no difference between wild type and het knock-in. So what we see mainly is 2 things. First of all, we see that there is a higher, the RNA counts for the potassium channel for KCNA5 encoding IKUR, potassium channel, is higher. And then these 2 mRNAs, KCND2 and D3, which encodes actually the components of ITO, were markedly lower in the homozygous knock-in than in the wild type. And this was interesting to see that in the neonates, it was also the same. These 2 channels were really lower in the homozygous knock-in than in the wild type. And there was some difference for other channels, but there was also a reduction of the expression of other potassium channels. So then we asked whether this reduction of potassium channels could result in a decline of the potassium channel currents. So, which could then explain, of course, the prolongation of the action potential. So this is what we did. I mean, not me, I always say that it's written, all the people who work, me, I did not do anything actually. So this is a protocol. So we actually started from the resting membrane potential, and then they first measured the outward potassium current, which is represented here, and at the end, they measured the inward potassium currents by hyperdepolarizing the cells. So you see these representative traces in wild type in black and in the homozygous knock-in mouse ventricular myocytes. And this was done, I forgot to say, with the whole cell patch clamp method. And you can see already a big difference between these two representative traces. And the current density of the potassium, the IK at the peak, IK peak, was markedly lower in the homozygous knock-in, but not in the heterozygous than the wild type. And in contrast, there was maybe a slightly lower IK late potassium current density, but this was not significantly different in this condition of nested PCR. Okay, at the end, the different components of the outward potassium currents, they were calculated by 3 different exponential curves, and they were expressed here in this part, and you can see that the different part of the potassium outward potassium channel current, you see again that there is no major difference between heterozygous knock-in and wild-type ventricular myocytes. In contrast, there was a marked reduction of all these potassium channel current density, indicating that this could participate in the prolongation of the action potential in homozygous knock-in ventricular myocytes. We also evaluated the L-type calcium current density, and this is a typical current voltage relationship performed in the wild-type mice or in the homozygous knock-in mice. In the absence or presence of 1 micromolar isoprenaline, you see that maybe it's a bit higher, but the difference was not significant, and therefore the L-type calcium current density did not differ between these two genotypes. At the end, we included all obtained electrophysiological data for sodium, potassium, and calcium currents into an in silico simulation of mouse ventricular action potential, and we obtained the following, which showed that prolongation in the homozygous knock-in compared to the wild type, and this really simulate what and support the experimental data in the homozygous knock-in mice. So these are mice, and the results showed that homozygous knock-in mice showed a loss of repolarizing potassium currents that leads to prolonged action potentials and refractory period. And second, this constitutes an arrhythmogenic substrate and occurs prior to the development of cadacapatrophy. So then we wanted to evaluate whether we could translate our findings in mice to humans. So we started with disease modeling with human-induced pluripotent stem cell-derived engineered heart tissue. We started with a control individual with its skin fibroblasts, which were reprogrammed into iPSC cells, and then we induced cardiac differentiation with the embryoid bodies and engineered heart tissue. So we also, in this control cell line, we use CRISPR-Cas9 to induce a mutation in myosin binding protein C to mimic the situation of the homozygous knock-in mice. So this was the results after differentiation into cardiomyocytes. So we obtained a homozygous T insertion in exon 6 of myosin binding protein C, and at the mRNA level we found 2 different mutants. The first one contains the T insertion, you can see it here, and this T insertion induces a frame shift and the production of very short mutant 1 protein, such as in knock-in mice, which is not detected as well by Western blot. And the mutant 2 actually contains the T insertion plus, here you see, the retention of a part of intron 8, somehow like in the knock-in mice, and this retention produce a reframe of the protein, and you see here in red the production of new amino acid internally. So we evaluated the expression of this myosin binding protein C on mRNA level. We used primers located in around exon 1 or exon 25, and both were markedly reduced in the homozygous knock-in EHTs compared to the wild type. isogenic control, and at the protein level, the full-length mutant was the level of the full-length mutant was markedly lower, and when normalized to cardiac troponin T, you see that it represents about 30% of the wild type in the isogenic control. So we then casted engineered heart tissue, and we could measure the amplitude of force and the kinetics of the contraction. And here I will not enter into all the details, but we measure the force over time. So this is represented here, force until 60 days about, and then the relaxation time, the beating frequency, and the RR scatter. And you see that actually the homozygous knock-in EHTs develop the force much quicker than the wild type. It's associated in most of the time points with the shorter relaxation time and the lower beating frequency, and the RR scatter, which actually represents the interdecile range of the mean beat-to-beat distance in unpaced EHT, and this is a marker of arrhythmogenicity. You can see that it was in general much higher in the homozygous knock-in EHT than the isogenic control. So we also measured whether there is an increase in myofilament calcium sensitivity in skinned human EHTs, and you see that this force PCA curve showed a tendency towards a left shift in the homozygous knock-in EHTs, such as in the mice, but this was not significant likely because of the small number of tissue. In contrast, there was a markedly higher force as well in these EHTs, and the N-IL coefficient did not differ significantly. So we also evaluated in this tissue the expression of the genes encoding ion channel, and we found a bit different things that in the mice. First of all, we also found that the RNA counts for several potassium channels in the middle here were markedly lower, like in mice, but we also found that the RNA counts of the genes encoding the L-type calcium channels was also lower, and also the RNA counts of SCN5A encoding the sodium channel. So in this homozygous knock-in EHT, there was a marked reduction of the expression of several genes which could account for abnormality of action potential. So we evaluated the action potential, and these are the results. I don't know whether you remember the action potential in mice, but this is already, you can see that it's as a different part. You don't see this typical notch in the beginning, but what you see as well mainly is that there is no major difference between the isogenic control and the homozygous knock-in EHTs at 50% and 90% of the repolarization. The takeoff potential was a bit slightly higher, but not significant. The amplitude did not change, and what was striking in contrast is that the maximum upstroke velocity was significantly lower in the knock-in EHTs. So this shows that the electrophysiological characteristics of homozygous Masi-Mani protein C mutation is different between human EHTs and mice. So in summary, for this second part, we found higher force in, I put intact, but it's not completely true. This is quicker development of force in skinned engineered heart tissue, a shorter relaxation time, a higher RR scatter suggesting arrhythmic behavior, slight increase in myofilament calcium sensitivity, and lower RNA counts for several potassium channels and for sodium and calcium channels. There was no prolongation of action potential, but lower maximal upstroke velocity. So at the end, we had the chance to get septal myectomies from HCM patients, in which we measured the action potential with sharp microelectrode as well. So actually we use septal myectomy of different HCM samples, and we compare them to cardiac sample obtained from patients who underwent surgical surgical surgery for aortic stenosis. So these were they were used as a control, and you see mainly that the action potential is very similar than in human EHTs and did not differ between these two groups. On the other hand, we put an extra sample for which we add the genotype analyzed, and it's also a heterozygous Masimanni protein C missense mutation in this case. And you see that the action potential actually was prolonged, and these samples represented in green here were also dotted in green there, and you see that the action potential duration did not differ between the two groups, but maybe here you see that this sample was had higher a prolonged action potential at 50% and 90% compared to the other HCM sample. So when we looked at the resting membrane potential, action potential amplitude, and maximum upstroke velocity, there was no difference between the two main groups, but this individual had still a higher maximum upstroke velocity. Importantly, and such as in mice, there was no correlation between action potential duration and septal thickness of the different patients analyzed in this study. And the patient with Masimanni protein mutation is here. He had a very strong septum, high septum thickness and prolonged APD at 90% of repolarization. Okay, and it's interesting to note that this patient actually we analyzed it as well before for the fourth PCA calcium relationship in human skin muscle strip. So this is the patient. This is 10 muscle strip of the patient compared to 17 non-failing samples. And you see as well on this fourth calcium relationship a shift to the left, indicating higher calcium sensitivity, which is represented here by a higher PCA50. So in summary for this part, action potential duration did not differ in samples of patients with HCM and aortic stenosis. There was no correlation between APD and septum thickness in HCM. On the other hand, the MYBPC3 causing HCM sample exhibited a prolonged action potential and increased myofilament calcium sensitivity. So with this, I would like to summarize the story. So we had 4 groups: the Masimanni protein C het knock-in mouse hearts, muscle strip, or cardiomyocyte. We found higher calcium sensitivity, arrhythmic behavior in cells in muscle strips, but not in the whole heart. There was no difference in RNA counts and conductivity of potassium channels, and no prolongation of action potentials. The homozygous knock-in mouse heart strips or cardiomyocytes, they show higher calcium sensitivity, arrhythmic behaviors in all conditions in cells, muscle strips, and whole heart. There was a lower RNA counts and conductivity of potassium channels, and longer action potentials and refractory period. The homozygous human EHTs showed a slightly higher calcium sensitivity of the myofilament and a lower RNA counts of potassium, calcium, and sodium channels. There was no prolongations of action potential, but lower maximum upstroke velocity. And finally, if we focus on the patient with the myosin binding protein C mutation at the heterozygous state, he presented a higher calcium sensitivity and longer action potential. So this is a bit complicated, all this. These are mice and humans, but in conclusion, we could say the following. This showed first that increased calcium sensitivity is a common feature in all models and human HCM associated with Masimanni protein C mutation. However, whether the prolonged action potential exists in human heterozygous, while the prolonged action potential has been shown in septal myectomy at the heterozygous state, we could not see this in the heterozygous knock-in mice. And the homozygous EHT did not reproduce the prolonged action potential observed in the homozygous knock-in mice, maybe because the lower depolarizing sodium current and potentially as well the calcium current could counterbalance the effect. So in conclusion, this study highlights species and or model differences and emphasize the importance of research in human or human-like samples. So with this, I would like to finish my talk. I want to present again all the people who participated in this study, particularly Fred, Thorsten, and many others as well who contributed, and also the different funding. And I'm happy to stop here and to answer your question. And I think we are going to be joined by Thorsten, who will collaborate the answer to your question. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Lucy. That was really great. So I'm seeing a lot of questions coming in, but just waiting for them really quick. I'd like to ask one. So when you looked at the beating frequency of your EHTs, was that spontaneous or paced? And if it was spontaneous, did you ever think about trying to challenge them with, like, you know, pacing them at 120 hertz or maybe something faster, and seeing if you could induce arrhythmias kind of similar to what you did with burst pacing in your Langendorf hearts?
So this is an excellent question, and so what I presented you, it was all on paced EHTs. The PACE protocol was not done, and indeed it will be very interesting to see whether we could induce more arrhythmic behavior after pacing. So this was really spontaneous beating.
Great, thank you. Davor, did you want to ask a question before I start reading the questions from the audience? Or
no, I think I'll reserve my questions to see how we're doing with time, if you don't mind.
Okay, sounds great. Okay, so I'll go ahead and go through these just in the order that they were asked. So Ursula Ravens asks, I think this is referring to the homo or heterozygous knock-in mice. Did you see any differences in atrial functions or I guess atrial arrhythmias?
As this was not evaluated, and I mean, it's not completely true. I mean, I think they measured the atrial refractory period, which did not differ between knock-in and wild-type mice. So this was a main, maybe Thorsten, you can see something else. So only the ventricle was affected, not the atria, in this model.
Okay. So moving on then, Jerome Monknuk asks, yeah, he's asking about, in order to understand arrhythmic mechanisms, did you look at calcium sparks or early or delayed after depolarizations?
Not yet. No, I mean, we did, in the past, we also analyzed the calcium transients, the calcium content of the sarcoplasmic reticulum with caffeine puff, and there was no major difference in calcium amplitude for the SR calcium content, but there was a faster calcium decay in the homozygous knock-in cardiomyocyte. I mean, these data are 10 years old minimum. I would have to go back to the paper, but I think it was like that. And then we evaluated whether there would be faster NCX activity, and we measured actually the NCX protein level in this model, and we found there was a lower amount of NCX. This was a bit, it was always a bit complicated in this model because it was not always straightforward, like you see immediately that there is abnormal EADs, DADs, or calcium sparks. And the level of sodium actually is not higher but lower in this model. then the discussion is more for Torsten, who is really an expert of all this electrophysiology, but it's not straightforward like in HCM in patient where there is an increased sodium, or in heart failure in the cardiomyostat. In this case, it was more a lower level of sodium.
So, sorry, do you mind if I jump in there, because I'm really curious now? So how I mean, the only time I've ever seen lower level of sodium was, I remember Maura Grice's paper, JCI, together with John Lederman a while ago on atrial arrhythmias. And I've never really seen a lower sodium in any, I guess, cardiomyopathy. So how do you get changes in calcium, calcium sensitivity, no changes in cytosolic calcium, but lowering of intracellular sodium? Because you'd think that there would be some sort of a compensatory mechanism through NCX, etc., to alter calcium levels as well. So how does that work? I'm curious. And sorry for a horrible question.
If someone has the answer, I'm very happy to take it as well. I cannot answer this so easily, because there was this faster calcium decay. I mean, we thought about, the calcium transient, the pacing-induced calcium transient is faster. The caffeine-induced calcium transient is faster, the calcium decay. The sodium is lower, so there is something compensating somewhere, but I cannot, I don't know. This is still open for evaluation.
Okay, so if you have a faster sodium calcium exchanger, then that does indicate that there is a lowering of sodium, I guess, which is interesting. I mean, Torsten, I'm sure you.
We did not measure we did not measure N6.
Oh, sorry. I thought you said it caffeine induced. I thought that you said that a caffeine induced calcium transient was faster, which would imply that this is driven by the NCX, right?
Yeah. But yeah.
So therefore, to me, that suggests faster NCX.
Yeah.
Is that right, Torsten? I mean, unless I'm mistaken.
This was what we observed. So we thought this is a faster calcium decay, means a faster NCX, right? But we did not measure it complete. So it's indirect measurements, right? Sure.
I mean, the only other thing that kind of gets in there is what calcium ATPase, and I think that works a lot slower, doesn't it? So I think it's driven by the NCX. But I mean, that's just, sorry. Okay, I'll shut up now.
Okay, so I guess on kind of a similar note, this is again from Ursula Ravens. So do you have an explanation for the changes in ion channel expression? And I guess this is referring to the changes you see either in mouse or in your EHTs. Is it like, how is a mutation in a sarcomeric protein causing changes in ion channels, which of course are non-sarcomeric?
So thank you, Ursula, for this question. I think we cannot answer this so easily. Also because we didn't measure the protein level. So we don't know whether this lower expression of the genes are associated with a lower protein level. So this I don't know. And why it is like that? This is, it's possible that, if we speak about sarcomeric genes, this is easy to explain because they are co-transcribed, co-translated, co-incorporated into the sarcomere. And with the potassium channel, we are at the mRNA level. Whether it's a compensation or really a direct consequence of the mutation, it's hard to answer this question. I don't know. Ursula, I'm sorry. But Torsten has an idea.
Maybe I just could give a comment. I think it's Fred has spent all his life in the lab to investigate arrhythmia mechanisms in HCM. And he has used the different models. And I think what's really important is that the different models will give different answers. And the question, what's true, what should we believe? And one of the main issues is that in the mice, you will have nice results. And in the human tissue, the tissue from the operation theater or the EHT, you have almost no effect of the transient potassium outward currents that are so heavily affected in the mice model. And I think this is it's a more general problem. We have to decide what model is more appropriate. And to be honest, we were surprised to see so small effects, and I think this is not shown in the paper, but we have tested for aminopyridine on action potentials in ventricular preparations in EHT, let's say ventricular EHT, as well in the left ventricular tissue. And there's no effect of 4-aminopyridine. And this is perplexing because people know, okay, there's a transient, there's a transmural transient, but there should be some effect. But the largest effect of 4-aminopyridine by blocking transient outward channels should be in the subepicardial layer. We do not have any excess. We took what we could get from the cardiac surgeons. We took sample from the septum because otherwise we do not have access to the tissue. And these are all critical points we have to think about. And also what does the EHT represent? What layer of the myocardial wall? Is it more subendocardial, more subepicardial, or mid-myocardial, or whatever? Or is more apex or base? And so I think Lucie and me, we are quite grateful that the editor found this paper important because I think it's an example, or it's a trial to find answer. And at the end, you are rather confused because depending on the model you have used, depending on the intervention to elicit arrhythmias, you can find almost, I would not say completely, but you will find different answers. And I think one major issue should be that we have to think about what is the appropriate model. Just my comment, sorry.
Yeah, just to finish to Ursula maybe as well. I mean, I think if the question, I understood this a bit differently than Thorsten, what explains the change in ion channel expression? Maybe it's also due to the fact that MYBPC3 homozygous knock-in and also the homozygous, I mean, if you have lower level of myosin maniprotein C3, the tissue is less developed. The cardiomyocytes are less, maybe less developed as well. So it's possible that there is also a compensation and reduction of the expression of other potassium channel. I don't know. Someone else asked this question also as well.
So just to follow up quickly on that, I know a lot of protocols have found that when you differentiate IPS cells into cardiomyocytes, you tend to get a mixture of cells with sort of an atrial and a ventricular and sometimes even a pacemaker identity. In your EHTs, do you think they are predominantly ventricular type cells, or do you think you have a mix as well? And could that be contributing to some of the differences you're observing between your mice and your human cells?
Now, this is an important point indeed, but the protocol we use for these EHTs, they are really a protocol for ventricular EHTs. I mean, Thorsten is an expert as well of atrial EHTs, and the protocol is different. He can detail it. And this has been validated by others in the institute with a specific staining for myosin light chain, for example, atrial versus ventricular. And in this ventricular EHT protocol, there are really 90% of cardiomyocytes are more EHT, ventricular type than, and you saw that also the action potential, it was not really like atrial, it was not really an atrial action potential, and it was also very similar between these human EHTs and the septal myectomy. So this is an argument on the top. Thorsten, you want to say something about the
I agree. No comment.
Okay, perfect. So just asking one or two more questions in the time we have left. So from David Bearfield, fantastic work. Do you observe any atrioventricle AV node block in either your Homer heterozygous knock-in mice? And then also he's asking, at either young or old ages, are you seeing ventricular fibrosis in your mouse models? And could that be contributing to some of the arrhythmogenesis that you observed?
I would like to take the first part of the question, Lucy.
Yeah, please.
Okay, there's no AV block, nor is there a difference in the Wenckebach point. So when you lose one-to-one conduction from atrium to ventricle. That's all to part one. Now it's up to you.
Yeah, so this is a, thank you, Dave, for your question. I think it's an important point indeed, because the homozygous knock-in, in contrast to the heterozygous knock-in, they do have more fibrosis. They have hypertrophy and fibrosis, and the heterozygous knock-in showed much less fibrosis. And this could indeed contribute to the arrhythmic phenotype in the whole heart for the homozygous versus heterozygous mice. Yeah. And in for the young, between young and old, I don't know, because we never analyze the fibrosis at P1, but I don't think that they have fibrosis. They don't have hypertrophy as well, so I believe that it starts much later. And I did not analyze fibrosis at the age of P8, postnatal D8, where they already have hypertrophy and cardiac dysfunction. But yeah, at least the difference between heterozygous and homozygous mice is clear as well, that the fibrosis could be involved in the arrhythmic phenotype.
Okay. So I think the next couple of questions have sort of been answered over the course of discussion. So I'll jump to this one, another one from Jerome Mocknock. So he's wondering if you've seen changes in mRNA expression before overt HCM. So are the changes in ion channels you see developing before significant hypertrophy is happening in your mice?
So thank you, Jerome, for your question. Yeah, there is a difference between postnatal day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8, and I cannot answer you in detail. And actually, we did more cell-like analysis, proteomic analysis in this early stage of development, which is not published actually. And well, I mean, then we saw the classical increase of myosin heavy chain 7 at protein level and other things, but in details, I don't think that we have the detail for the potassium channel at this age as well. I will have to check this in detail, but thank you for the question.
Okay, and then last question from Christopher Solis. Do you know what channel subunit is actually causing the prolonged action potentials? And he's wondering if you can modulate channel subunit expression levels, like normalize some of the differences you're seeing in your mRNA data, and if normalizing one in particular might cause the prolonged APUC to disappear or become like wild type.
This question relates to work in mice, I expect.
Yeah, that would make sense, since that's where the big difference in AP is.
So this we did not do. Right?
I think we try to dissect the different potassium outward currents by curve fitting. This is what other people have done. And as you may have seen in the nicely colored bar graph, it's not so that there's just one component. It's more or less, it's a homogeneous decline. So we do not believe that it's just one potassium channel.
Okay, so a complex effect, and I suppose rescuing expression in isolated cardiomyocytes would be quite challenging.
Yeah.
As we all know. Okay, well, I think that's all of the questions. So thank you for everyone that tuned in today. And it was a great talk. I think we all really enjoyed it. So thank you, Dr. Carrier, and thank you, Dr. Krust. And of course, to the audience, be sure to tune into the next ISHR webinar. And I think that's later in November.
Well, from my side, thank you very much, Walter, for the introduction and sharing the discussion. And Davor, of course, for all what you do for these GMCC ISHR webinars. It's wonderful, and I think everybody appreciates this. Thank you, Torsten, to be with me.
Thank you all.
See you to the next webinar.
Thank you for a really, really exciting webinar. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.